But guys, we have a ton to get into. I guess start with Hans-Joachim Watzke, Stefan. The news today that he is going to step down from his duties at Borussia Dortmund in 2025. Basically ad hoc statement, which they have to do because they are a stock exchange company in Germany. They had to announce this. The statement basically said that he's not going to renew his contract. He's saying that he's done. An end of an era for Borussia Dortmund, but I would argue it's about time.
Yeah. It's yeah, you're right. It was quite surprising. And possibly a surprise for a lot of people at Dortmund too. I was speaking to someone this afternoon about who the kind of person is that's lined up to replace him, because that's obviously something that hasn't been confirmed or even speculation seems to be few and far between at the moment. And speaking to someone who kind of knows the inner workings of the club, and they were telling me that the reason perhaps that he's given himself such a long shall we say kind of swan song is because none of that has even been discussed yet. Nothing's planned, nothing's in line. There is no successor in place as of yet. So in a sense it was kind of out of the blue, and it also is fascinating when you kind of contextualize it within what's going on at Dortmund right now, the upheaval at the club, the real kind of just sheer amount of reaction they've had to do to what that first half of the season, whether it be the head coaches that have come in, and Nuri Sahin and Bender as well, whether it's the players they're trying to sign, who we'll obviously go on to talk about later on the show, and now the board itself seems to be getting a rejig. So it seems like from top to bottom, there's a lot going on at Dortmund, and yeah, Watzke's going to leave a very interesting legacy. The thing that keeps coming to mind, and this obviously shows my age, I guess, in the sense that, and the kind of internet culture that I grew up in, but it reminds me of that line from the Dark Knight. You either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain. And I think there's a degree of that with Watzke, in the sense that what he did for Dortmund, in terms of getting them through very difficult kind of financial struggles. In more times, and in two senses, in the sense, obviously the first time, but also during COVID as well, which is what kind of led to him extending his role, because I think there was the general consensus that he was planning on kind of packing it in before that, but stuck around to steady the ship through those kind of very troubled waters. But he now kind of steps down with a lot of frustration, I think, from fans. I mean, I think once he does move on, the kind of that frustration will kind of melt away, and people will look back with rose-tinted glasses at the successes the club had when he was in charge, and they were a lot of successes. But I think it's probably fair to say that maybe he kind of extended that beyond when he should have. But anyway, I'll shut up and let someone else talk.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. I think you point out something very important here, that when I said it's about time, I don't mean because he hasn't done in generally a good job, because I think he really did. I mean, he steered Dortmund through diverse crises, saved the club from financial ruin, right? And then turned them into a club that, for a time at least, really challenged Bayern Munich. I think what happened after is where a lot of discontent has come, where they just never really seem to fulfill their potential completely. And this notion of not maybe bringing in the sort of change needed to compete in modern football, this idea of always, being a seller's club, I think there needs to be a development step that comes beyond that. And Matt, I'm really surprised Carsten Kramer's name isn't mentioned as an automatic successor. We've seen at Bayern Munich how difficult that successorship can be, and obviously Uli Hoeneß is more or less back. But this is going to be quite a difficult transition, right?
Yeah, but as Stefan said, that's why they've given themselves a good 18 months, or so best part of 18 months now to sort all this out. The announcement in the great scheme of things, didn't come as big as big a surprise to me as it perhaps I don't know, maybe did to Stefan, or at least the way you were talking about it. Because as you mentioned, this was mooted a few years ago, just before just before COVID hit, and the reason for him staying was to help steer the good ship Borussia Dortmund through the pandemic. And Dortmund were hit extremely hard by the pandemic, harder than most, simply by virtue of having the biggest stadium and losing the most gate seats. Although there were other reasons as well. You'll either, I think, on balance, a positive legacy. The COVID crisis was the third big challenge that he steered Dortmund through. We've already mentioned the financial crisis, which posed a genuinely existential threat to the club back in 2003-05. That was when Watzke joined the board. He'd already been in the club for a few years as treasurer, I think, but he joined the board in 2005. And played a decisive role and a key role in helping to stabilise the club, set it up in a financially stronger position. Obviously, helped, and not sure if it was helped by that, but he was certainly one of the leading figures who oversaw Borussia Dortmund's development as a club listed on the stock exchange. So he has been a key figure. The second challenge, which we haven't mentioned yet, was, I think, often gets forgotten in a lot of discussions around Dortmund in recent years, is the bomb attack in 2017. Watzke played let's say important, key role in that. I think, depending on who you ask, for good or for bad. I don't think he was completely without blame in the aftermath. I think if you asked Thomas Tuchel and some of the players, they would probably still have criticisms of elements of his actions around that. But given the magnitude of the situation, I think on balance, I think Watzke did do a generally good job of steering the club through yet another difficult time. And even though I think it's right to point out that there are clearly frustrations these days, and if there does seem to be a lack of strategy on the pitch, off the pitch, transfer policy, youth policy, what Borussia Dortmund should stand for, if there are those doubts now, then I think Watzke does have that to answer. It probably is why it's come to an end. I don't think there's any harm in things coming to an end, but that's up there. Are questions for the future, but that probably shouldn't cloud over the fact that the philosophy that came to be criticised a little bit by the ends in Dortmund, too much of a selling club. I think it's also forgotten sometimes that, in cooperation with Michael Zorc and others at Dortmund, that Watzke was a key element in developing that sort of club football / business strategy in the first place. Scouting well, scouting cheap, buying cheap, but with the absolute intention of selling on, because that was the method that they identified with which they could challenge Bayern Munich, and they had differing amounts of success in that. I think just because that philosophy, that strategy wore itself out in the end, I don't necessarily think that means it was a complete failure on Hans-Joachim Watzke's part. But it probably does mean that it makes sense for all parties to move on. And as we said, Borussia Dortmund are at a fork in the road, and it's the end of an era there, and they've got best part of 18 months to work out where to go from here.
I think, just to jump in there, Manu, very briefly before we maybe move on, just to kind of hammer home that point that Matt was saying there, that if you do, because it is, you go in the forums and stuff, and it is, you see a lot of kind of Dortmund fans frustrated with Watzke and the way the club's behaved, and God knows we've done it as well on this show, and we've talked about Watzke maybe having to move on a number of times, but you have to take that with, you have to balance that out with what he accomplished at the club, and just thinking about it, I think you could make a strong argument he's arguably one of the most important people that Dortmund have ever had as a single individual, because how important he was to, we're talking about a club here that went from the verge of bankruptcy to, back-to-back Bundesliga titles in the space of 10 years. And, of course, Dortmund would have probably stumbled on somehow without him, but we would have been talking about another Kaiserslautern or something. I genuinely believe that, in the sense that they would have been relegated and it would have been turmoil. And, German football is, it's a graveyard of former giants that have struggled financially and fallen on hard times and really struggled to get back on their feet. Perhaps Schalke are unfortunately a good example of that, although there's probably far more severe examples of that possibly. And so I think that is really worth pointing out, in terms of that period of Dortmund's history. And, as Matt said, the way that they managed to gamify modern football and the economics of modern football to kind of give themselves a leg up. And as Matt said, maybe Michael Zorc was perhaps the real architect behind that part of it, but that's something that will be the top line of his obituary when it comes to Dortmund. It's not going to really be the politics in his latter years, maybe the malaise, which you could argue is maybe just a natural reaction to the fact that they were so good at gaming a certain period of European football that naturally what came next is something that, lightning doesn't strike twice, shall we say. It's that kind of aspect that, and that's why people like ourselves who watch Dortmund week to week, year in, year in, and Dortmund fans themselves would say have grown frustrated in recent years, because they knew how well it worked in the past and why it's not working now. And maybe Dortmund took too long to realise that themselves. And, as Matt said, maybe obviously the COVID pandemic elongated Watzke's, maybe how he felt a necessity to stay there and keep things ticking along. But it's almost like what that kind of financial prudence and that kind of care that he and Zorc and others put towards finances of the club were his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, in the sense that it was obviously crucial to them getting beyond that bankruptcy situation. But in latter years of his reign, you could see and you could argue that Dortmund were a club that were run by numbers rather than real sporting merit or sporting demands. And I think that's probably why there's a complicated aspect of Watzke's legacy. But I think in time, the stuff that happened earlier will far outweigh these kind of last kind of 5 or 6 years of frustration.
I mean, when you look at it, the bottom line is 2 Bundesliga titles. I think 2 German Cups as well.
3, I think.
3, yeah, you're right. 1 under Klopp, 1 under Terzic, and 1 under Tuchel. 3. The Champions League final, of course. I think except for 1 year after the Klopp era, every year in the Champions League, I think there's only 1 year they missed out. These are... It's astonishing considering where the club was when they were almost bankrupt in the early 2000s. It just seems like the next development step is now needed. And I think this is where we get to this, and Matt, you rightfully pointed this out, as a fork in the road, right? It's going to be fascinating to see what comes next. And, the news is still fresh. I've spoken a couple of times to Carsten Kramer, who is, sort of the right-hand man for Hans-Joachim Watzke, and I think is quite progressive. It's going to be interesting to see whether he goes to step up, and I think this is maybe something to consider, if they're going to go club external, if they're going to bring in someone who's not currently at the club. These things can be difficult, and I can only point at Bayern Munich, where they also and initially hoped that they would have lots of time for the transition, right? Karl-Heinz Rummenigge stayed on for a year to work with Oliver Kahn, yet that didn't work out. They're essentially back to where they were before, with a completely new board that still adds people. That's what I mean. Like, even with that 8-month period, a transition like that can be difficult. And I'm just so very curious to see where they're going to go with it. I know we're entering a little bit of speculative territory, guys, but would it be maybe better for them to go external? Matt, what do you think?
I think either way, it's going to have to be, whether internal or external, it's going to have to be somebody who can come to terms and get to grips with what is going to be in the next few years, and perhaps sooner than we think, a completely new football world. I don't think it's a surprise that Watzke stepped down so soon after his interim period in charge of the German Football League, DFL. If we go back to some of the chats we had last year about the initial attempt to secure a private equity investor deal, that was under the interim co-leadership of Watzke and Axel Hellmann, and I think Watzke very much saw that as his baby as well, and I think he was I know he was visibly shocked and pretty distraught, it seemed, when that initial vote went against him back in May. Obviously, he still retains a place on the supervisory board at the DFL, but it's going to be a new football going forward. The UEFA Champions League reform is already in the starting gates and ready to go. We've already had our final group stage, haven't we? So that's also history. And we have an expanded FIFA Club World Cup around the corner. So all of these issues, you've got challenges of state ownership, multi-club ownership. All these issues are going to characterise global football in the coming years, which is probably another reason why it's probably a good thing for someone like Watzke to end his era and hand it over to somebody who, for good or for bad, can navigate these waters. And I think whoever does take over Dortmund in those waters, I think he'll or she will take over a club which is well set up to do so. For years in Dortmund, they've been talking about finding this famous balance between Beijing and Borsigplatz. So Borsigplatz being the square in just north of Dortmund city centre where the club were founded, where they go around the roundabout celebrating titles, even if Dortmund fans could remember long enough back to remember celebrating Bundesliga titles. But yeah, and so that's the old traditional Borussia Dortmund and Beijing, I suppose used as just as a symbol of general global support and global interest in the club. So Dortmund are no strangers to that. So they're not the worst placed club in the world to deal with this new world, but they're going to be the key challenges for whoever follows Watzke.
It's a top 10 European club. I mean, you have to say that, right? At least top 10, top 20. Stefan, lots of people would like that job, I would assume.
Yeah, they would. As Matt said, there's a kind of new stage of European football coming along. They may be a top 10 European club, but unfortunately, the future European football may suggest that means they're actually the 30th or 40th richest club in Europe after 20 or 30 English teams, as the way things seem to be going. And that's always kind of been Dortmund's struggle in the modern era, is much like Bayern or Leverkusen or, Real Madrid or Inter Milan, PSG, or maybe not PSG, but, Marseille. All these clubs are kind of dealing with the kind of changing current of European football and the money that English football kind of sucks in. So, and hey, look, Dortmund more than anyone else have benefited from that over the last kind of 5 or 10 years, and the way that they've sold players and the way that they've made money from players. And, we're about to talk about one who they made an absolute fortune off and are now getting back for free more or less than 2 years later or 3 years later. So, that's a perfect example of how Dortmund have managed to kind of navigate that previous era, but they do need someone who can think a little outside the box going forwards, and someone who, I keep coming back to this, but isn't just going to be beholden to the spreadsheets at the end of the financial year every year and pat themselves on the back if those look better than the league table come May. That I think Dortmund fans are perhaps a little sick of the spreadsheet coming before the league table, if you will. Of course, there has to be financial prudence. Of course, the club's future has to be goes beyond doubt. But I think they do need someone who kind of thinks outside the box from a sporting point of view, because the club's kind of transfer policy over the last kind of couple of years has been more and more hoping to kind of hit a home run with these kind of young players that they kind of hoover up from France and England, and then just kind of filling in the rest of the squad with bog standard Bundesliga players and asking an average head coach to make it work. And, and that's the sad thing when we talked about, I remember when Erling Haaland left the club, I wrote a piece saying that he scored a bazillion goals for Dortmund, but if you actually look at the club's progress, either in the league or in Champions League, it didn't move the needle at all. And Jude Bellingham came very close to winning a Bundesliga title, but aside from that, it was the same sort of thing. So that's the kind of frustration I think people have with Dortmund from a sporting point of view, whereas maybe on a business level, they've ticked along just fine. And I think they need someone after Watzke who can kind of flip that and make them a success on a sporting level, whereas maybe in a financial level, they go back to being a very kind of normal bog standard club.
Yeah, I think sporting wise, Stefan makes a good point. It probably is the last few, like 4 or 5 or maybe 4 or 5 years under Watzke. I think you can express genuine sporting criticisms of Dortmund, and like I said, it's because that initial philosophy, business plan that they had did tend to peter out, and they wanted to take the next step. They identified, in my opinion, incorrectly, that next step was to supplement the young talents they had coming through with proven Bundesliga talent. Hence why they've ended up with the likes of Marcel Sabitzer, Niklas Füllkrug, Emre Can, Bent Baini, etc. All leading the line, and that was the decision they made. I think that was an incorrect one. I think it's probably showing this season it's not the way to go. So you need someone to think outside the box. That's where I think someone external probably then would be my choice. Some of the coaching choices in recent years have also been questionable. You would have thought on paper that Marco Rose would have been a really good fit for Dortmund, but obviously didn't work out after a very, very short time. Thomas Tuchel, there were obviously extenuating mitigating circumstances surrounding the bus attack, and Tuchel as a personality himself who clashed with Watzke, obviously a powerful personality.
Where would Dortmund be if Tuchel had never clashed with Watzke?
I mean, I think it's a massive. I think it's an if we've discussed before, but it's, the clash with Watzke was itself inextricably linked to the bus attack. So it's difficult to really take one without the other. Although, Watzke was such a dominant alpha male figure at Borussia Dortmund, was always would probably also always struggle with that sort of powerful coaching character. If you can criticise him also, I'd say some of the coaching decisions and appointments. I think most recently, I think the Terzic, we've discussed it loads of times, haven't we?
And we'll probably lots more.
We probably will lots more, yeah. He's not proven yet that he has the pedigree to take Borussia Dortmund to the next level. And I mean, I'll happily be proven wrong, I suppose, but I fail to see how the decision to bring in Sven Bender and Nuri Sahin by Terzic's side will really help that. Might be proven wrong. And to an extent, the same applies to Sebastian Kehl as sporting director. I think he's a good operator to deal with. He may have a bright future as a functionary and as an executive ahead of him. I think he is an intelligent operator. But his transfer operations and squad building haven't been up to scratch so far. There's no other way to put that.
Yeah, but okay, I'm going to defend Sebastian Kehl here, Matt, because I know that he wanted to do things a little different and he wasn't allowed to. And I think I've reported that as well, that there were certain deals that Sebastian Kehl wasn't allowed to do because Terzic and Watzke vetoed it, mostly Terzic. But, guys, Stefan said players moving the needle for Borussia Dortmund. Now one of those players that also didn't move the needle, although he did win the Pokal, I guess, with Erling Haaland, is Jadon Sancho. And I do want to move the discussion to that topic.